This is Concepts, where two pretentious sirs quibble over ideas that explain today's world. Phil Shea and Steve Rose. Welcome to the Concepts Podcast.
Welcome.
Steve is taking the reins on this one again. It's the second time. So, Steve, what are we talking about?
We're talking about fundamental attribution error.
Yes.
Sounds super boring, doesn't it?
Yeah, and also I think it's a more technical name because I ended up looking up something when you told me that we were going to be doing this.
Yeah.
So the easier one is actor-observer bias. I always confused the two because I thought they were different, but apparently they're pretty similar, almost synonyms.
Yeah.
Care to elaborate?
I don't know if we're going to title this Your Concept or Mine is the same thing when it comes down to it. Although fundamental attribution error sounds like a super technical, boring title, it's actually a really interesting concept that I've been fascinated by for years. It's huge in social psychology, explains a lot about our perceptions of other people and their perceptions of us, and it explains society and all the rest of it we can get into. The simple definition from the APA dictionary, that's the American Psychological Association's online dictionary, quote, "It's the tendency to overestimate the degree to which an individual's behavior is determined by his or her abiding personal characteristics, attitudes, or beliefs, and correspondingly to minimize the influence of the surrounding situation on that behavior." That sounds super technical, but it's a simple...
Yeah, I was going to say we should dumb that down.
The easy way of saying it, it's when others mess up, they're bad. But when you mess up, it's not your fault.
Yeah, I was just tired and hungry, and everyone else should obviously know this because I had a rough day so far. But that guy, He came in and was just a dick to everybody. He is an asshole.
Yeah. To put it more simply, it's when we judge someone else's behavior, we judge it as due to personal characteristics. When we judge our own behavior, we judge it as situational factors.
For others, it's internal and static.
Yep.
It's permanent. For ourselves, it's externally caused and temporary.
Yes.
I was just having a bad day, but that guy's a jerk.
Yes.
Before we dive too far into this, actually, I wanted to cover the fallacy of change that I came across when finishing up the episode 6, cognitive distortions. So a cognitive distortion that I found that was useful, and I thought I would just bring it up here to throw it in.
To derail my episode right from the beginning.
Yeah, it's a power move. I just got to take it.
Move.
It's mine now.
Oh.
Yeah. So I just thought it was very interesting, especially since I tend to succumb to it. Maybe that's particularly why I think it's interesting.
Oh, everything's about you.
Exactly. So exactly. That's what this is about. The fallacy of change. Okay. The fallacy of change. So the easiest definition is from Wikipedia. I'll just read it. Quote, relying on social control to obtain cooperative actions from another person. The underlying assumption to this thinking style is that one's happiness depends on the actions of others. Fallacy of change also assumes that other people should change to suit one's own interests automatically and or that it is fair to pressure them to change. End quote. The next line basically says that it's present in most abusive relationships because I tend to try to egg someone on when I think I've got the solution for them. And I've come to let go of that over time. But I thought it was something that would be useful to at least bring up. What do you think?
Well, of course, as an addiction counselor, that's the fundamental truth of how to talk to someone is to not try to pressure or force change or to assume your answer is the answer. And it's letting go of expectations. So I completely agree.
Right. Circling back again to that, they are the masters of their own world, or what was it? Experts of their own lives. That's it.
Yeah. People are experts of their own lives. And they are not experts of other people's lives, which brings us back to our concept of...
Exactly. There we go. Nicely brought back. Tucked right in.
Yes.
Seamless.
Yes. And so when we see someone do something we dislike, we would make assumptions about that person's character. And the fundamental attribution error teaches us that we are often mistaken when we make judgments about other people. And maybe we'll get into a few practical examples to really drive this home again. A really common example is when you're driving and somebody just cuts you off. And what's the first thing you say or think about that person?
I don't drive very often, but I would guess some sort of expletive, swearing at them or calling them a jerk.
Yeah. Or that person is selfish. They are mean, rude,
reckless,
reckless, personal characteristics. We're judging personal characteristics here. And now let's flip it around. What's the first thing you think when you accidentally cut someone off?
I mean, you would obviously examine the factors that influenced it. Like, I don't know, you dropped something you were holding on to, or you were switching the radio, or you didn't notice this thing ahead of you on the road that you had to swerve to avoid.
Right.
But the other drivers may not see that.
Or you'd say something like, that person came out of nowhere.
When you cut someone off?
Yeah.
Why would you? Oh, because you weren't aware that they were in your blind spot.
Yeah. You cut someone off. It's an accident. And you're like, whoa, that person came out of nowhere. So when someone cuts us off, that person is bad. When we cut someone else off, it was kind of a situational thing. It says nothing about our character.
Right. Though I can see the benefit of this, like why it would have evolved. Because if you think about it, well, for one, like our perspective always makes us aware of all the things that are going on. And we see the factors, at least the overarching factors. We may not know like our subconscious's reaction sometimes, but most of the time. I think also it's more useful because we're trying to predict other people's behaviors and we're trying to see what is a constant pattern with them. In this particular example, this person's a one-off. They're not necessarily going to even enter our lives or cross our paths again. So thinking this person's dangerous, I should avoid them, would seem to be functional to me. What do you think?
Is it really functional though? Shouting expletives and believing that person is evil and bad and selfish. From my understanding, that only leads to increased anger and then more reckless driving, perhaps tailgating them, cutting them off as a retaliation. And I've heard a recent story of someone actually getting out of their car and slamming on the window of that car that cut them off. And so is it really functional to be going around with this error?
I would say you are, well, one, it's not an either or error. This is a false dichotomy. It's not black and white. It's definitely a gradient because like we may recognize that they have these things. But also what you're describing is somebody with emotional control issues, probably rage issues that they can't step away from it because it's still not like, okay, how we respond to that is still independent of where we place the blame, right? Because if I think that person's crazy, I'm going to avoid them and I'm like, there's no point in getting angry because I'm not going to like take retribution on them. I'm not going to seek to get revenge. For me, I would just take that as a warning to like avoid this person because they may do some erratic thing before, like again, which could again endanger me. So I would get away, but I can see how some people would run with it.
Most people?
That's, I think, a different issue.
I think you're being extremely rational here.
I think most people, a lot of people are going to get a fear response and then get annoyed, but not many are going to fully go into like a barbarian rage of just like seeking to hunt this person down. That is not the majority of people.
I think the majority of people throw the driver out of their car and teach them a life lesson.
Yeah. I think if you actually believe that, which I don't think you do, but if you did, I would say you're extremely primed with the people you're speaking to in these counseling calls of yours. You're getting distressed people who need you to talk them down.
Yeah. Yeah. This is just kind of a helpful reframe that I do talk about actually with clients, really. Maybe who have tendency toward anger. And we look at reframing. This is an example that I often bring up and an opportunity for people to practice reframing. And not just for traffic road rage, but for other situations in life where they are often blaming other people are bad. And so the traffic example is an opportunity to practice when it happens, because if you drive any distance, you will frequently encounter these scenarios, and you can use them as opportunities to practice reframing, saying, okay, is this person inherently bad and selfish and reckless and all the rest of it? Or let's look at other potential options. Maybe they have a sick child they are rushing to the hospital. Maybe there's an elderly person, a family member dying, and they have to make it there to say their last goodbyes. Maybe they just have really bad diarrhea.
Maybe they just burnt themselves by spilling coffee on their lap.
Maybe. What else? That's a reframe. It's a reframe.
But that reframe's not even, that part isn't even necessary. Like, let's say they are just a careless asshole. Like, you're right that we should challenge that belief to begin with. But even if they are, and we know for a fact, based on the history of this person, that they're generally a jerk, it's still within our control to not react with uncontrolled rage and to see that they are, I guess my whole, like I was saying the other day to you, was about like free will and how to view ourselves. They are still, just as Dale Carnegie says, there but for the grace of God go I. It's just another person that if we were them, we would act exactly as they do. So even if they are a jerk, they can't help it. That's how their brain chemistry forces them to act. even with the understanding that they are a bad person by your measure, we can still control our response in that that is just who they are, and we just have to control ourselves in a way that protects ourselves from their abuse.
Oh, wow. You've almost essentialized them as this is so much part of their character. It's even like genetic, woven in. It's who they are. They're just a jerk.
I'm saying, I'm going to the opposite extreme. I'm saying, even if that were true, you can still manage your life in a functional way that doesn't require you to give them all these excuses. Because the reason I'm hesitant to give into that entirely is because having studied psych and obviously known a lot of people who have also studied psych, you kind of see this common tendency of people to say, they have, say, an abusive family member, and they're like, oh yeah, but they're like this for a reason. And they go through all the reasons for it, but then they don't go the next step and protect themselves. They continue to endure that abuse because they can see why the person is abusive. The person themselves who is abusive likely suffered abuse themselves at an earlier point, and that's where they picked it up, as well as genetics. The problem, though, is that they continue to endure the suffering and abuse from that person because they can explain it. But explanation does not necessarily mean justification or accepting that behavior.
It doesn't. Of course it doesn't. And so we can accept that something comes from somebody's past trauma or whatever and situational factors and not necessarily have to label them an inherent abuser. And you say, well, hurt people. Okay. And it doesn't mean you put yourself back in the situation. And so it's a both and rather than or. You know what I mean?
Act, yeah.
And for the driver, maybe they do have really bad diarrhea and they're like speeding to get to a public washroom.
I'm just wondering how many times this describes you.
Never. I barely drive these days.
Not once, I'm sure.
I barely even drive these days.
Yeah, historically speaking. Anyway, continue with your thought.
So this could be true. And it doesn't justify being reckless because now you're not going to only have GI problems. You're going to have, or messy pants problems. You're going to have like harming people on the road problems. So it can explain it and it doesn't justify it.
Right, because you're still raising the risk of the people around you. From the perspective, again, I guess you're focusing on two aspects of the same problem, I think. Yours is about diagnosing the cause, and I'm talking about our response to whatever we diagnose the cause to be.
Exactly.
Well, two things. One was a response to what you just said. It was that video. I really hope I can find it for the show notes. Your trauma response triggers my trauma response, or triggers my trauma.
My trauma response triggers your trauma. My trauma response triggers your trauma.
Yeah, that one.
It's like a electronic beat put to that statement. Yeah.
Yeah, and repeated. There's that, but also from my side, the quote that comes to mind is anger is like holding on to a hot coal and waiting to throw it at them. You're basically just hurting yourself in the attempt of an end that's not going to help anybody ultimately. So it's probably best to let it go.
Yeah. And the reason why I bring up letting it go connected to fundamental attribution error and reframing is because the reframing is one way to let it go.
Right.
Like you can still be cautious driving around a reckless person and say, well, maybe they're racing to the hospital or some other kind of compassionate reasoning. And so it doesn't necessarily dictate that you're just like, oh, they're just doing that. Keep going, do what you got to do. It's more of like a way to keep your anger in check because you're less prone to anger when you frame it that way.
True. This also makes me think of another possible reason would be cultural differences. Because in China, they drive kind of, by comparison to here, a lot more recklessly. But the thing that's amazing to me is that despite the density in Beijing, they actually I witnessed very few accidents. And I think the reason this is because when we cross cultures in this way, there are a number of laws on paper that we should follow. But as we know, driving, we often don't follow all of them, or maybe we're not even aware of all of them. Like I think in Canada, for instance, and probably a lot of North America, we drive on the right side of the road. If you are in the left lane, the center lane of a 4-lane street, you're supposed to seek the right lane at all times. You're not supposed to stay in the left lane. It's mainly for passing by design. That's the law. However, people ignore that all the time. They just drive on both sides, right? Likewise, in China, they had a collective shared understanding, generally speaking, of which laws are upheld in practice and which laws are basically ignored. And when they come here, for instance, or we go there, we don't have that shared understanding, that cultural context for which laws are not fitting. And we tend to conform to the ones we're used to. And so the people around us aren't aware that we're going to break this in that way. Without knowing that that's possible, we'll do something and possibly cause an accident or make people think that we're crazy or bad drivers. when in reality, we're in a different cultural context. Anyway, that's just another explanation that came to mind.
That's very much related to a point that I wanted to discuss, that cultural context does matter also for the fundamental attribution error.
Interesting.
Could you imagine which societies are more prone to this error?
Japan.
Whoa. You didn't even let me finish the question.
I thought you were framing up for which people might not follow this.
Yes.
Who would? I would say individualist societies
Exactly.
would be most likely to give into it. Whereas I thought you were going to ask which ones didn't.
Yes.
Which I think Japan would be number one for collectivists, putting the blame on oneself.
That's why you have to wait for me to finish sometimes.
Gotta jump the gun. I'm excited.
Too much. Okay.
I'm engaged. What do you want?
I guess I'm just so engaging.
Oh, yeah.
But you're right, yes. Americans or individualistic societies, Western societies in general, are actually more prone to the fundamental attribution error than collectivist societies, for example, Japan, as you quickly noted there. And so there's a study by Miller in 1984. We can link this. They did a study on American children, comparing them to Hindu children. And they found that as American children grow older, they place increasing reliance upon disposition or the person's character as an explanation for events that they are observing, whereas the children in India, by contrast, place more explanations on situational factors. And so they were actually able to note that the cultural context really matters.
I'm actually curious about that experiment because I'd want to do a manipulation check, which is something to do in experiments to make sure that the thing that you're manipulating or the thing that you're measuring is actually what you think it is. Mm-hmm. So in this context, Hinduism is a stand-in for collectivism, but India is a more collectivist society, but why Hinduism? I'm curious. Anyway, yeah, that makes sense.
Hindu children of India, so from India, I guess it would just happen to be specifying the demographic.
Yeah, it's odd. I assume that the researchers found that there's a correlation there, but maybe because I guess we're all with reincarnation and all that, we're all united in that way. All life is roughly, I guess, equal and doing what it does. So I guess maybe that's why. I don't know.
I just think the context of India or more of a collectivist context was what they were referring to.
Sure.
I'd want to see the study done in Japan, as you so quickly noted again.
Wait, do you have one, or you say
no,
you want to see one?
I would like to see that study repeated in Japan. Though the problem with Japan now is we can talk about what's going on there. It's turning very much individualistic in a strange way.
Oh, right. Yeah, true. Actually, funny enough, I reached out to one of my Japanese friends I studied Mandarin with. He is living, I think, in Vietnam, but I was asking him how it is in terms of keeping in touch with people in Japan and the kind of career workload. So that's interesting that you brought it up.
Yeah. And the consumerization of dating is another interesting area as well. Yeah. So they're turning highly individualistic in some ways, yet there's a lot of honor and custom. So they kind of have both going on. I'd wanted to really see multiple contexts compared. But hold
on though.
What's that?
Honor doesn't necessarily conflict with individualist society. Americans had honor cultures in the South, the Appalachian region.
Mm-hmm. Right. Let's see. What's the connection here? Cultures of honor, they value loyalty and local community over reliance on large bureaucracy.
Yes, but that's also because of the context that they arise from. Cultures of honor typically come from situations where they can easily have their entire wealth rustled, aka herding cultures. So if you have all your money in cows, then you have to be very adamant to protect your honor, because any slight that you let slide makes it seem like you're weak, and people will come and beat you up and take all your wealth, leaving you and your family destitute. So that's kind of where it came from. Yep. I'm not really sure how that happened in Japan, because they were more of a farming society from what I understand, but I guess they were warring a lot.
Yeah.
I don't know. So anyway, we got a little derailed there. Where were you going?
Yeah, it's just noting the differences between different societies and individualistic ones, like the idea of the American dream. You pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And this leads to a kind of a discussion question that I planned for.
Wait, hold on. Can you hold on to that? Because we can jump back onto that, but I had something
What's that?
To say with what you just said. Where it kind of comes from, the individualization in Japan, at least, is The concept I wanted to do, and probably we may do next, is internalized capitalism, because for them, they were very collectivist, but as they've gotten more and more affluent and everyone is pushed to be like this cult of productivity, like they have the whole concept of people dying at their desks and being kind of estranged from their parents. The parents push them to have kids. It's very similar to China, actually, in the pressures socially, where the parents push them to perform because they're worried that if their kid doesn't like constantly perform and constantly train, then they will fall behind, and then the entire family will be dishonored and fall behind. So they end up being estranged from their parents a lot of the time because they are just so focused on the performance outcomes and less on whether the kids are happy. In a result, it ends up being more isolating. Like I have friends that say that they're kind of similar to us in a way, well, me in a way, where you kind of keep yourself as a contained unit and you reach out to your parents occasionally, but with a certain purpose, not just to emote. It seems like you're correct in that. And like, again, with all the working, they have no prospects for dating or time for dating because they both had no experience all of their formative years. They've been just training too much, the upper ones at least. And so they end up having no skills in that and are maybe too shy, especially in Japan where social judgment is so strong.
This really does lead into the question very well, actually.
Okay.
Does laziness exist?
Does laziness actually, I really love that question because I think, yes, laziness is an inherent trait to most species because we don't want to waste energy needlessly. The whole use it or lose it concept is a mechanism that fully lives in our body. Like if you don't use your muscles, they wither away because your body doesn't want to waste resources maintaining that. And actually, I really wish I would have revisited that video before this. Just ran out of time.
Yeah, you sent me the perfect video right before, and I didn't even have time to watch it. And it was on this exact topic.
There was a philosopher that she brings up in that video, which I guess we'll link as well. I wanted to dive further into that, where they said that I think this is a memory based off like 5 days ago in passing. I think they said that to be laziness is a virtue in a way, because that's kind of the foundation of all technology and science. We're like Mr. Freeburn in high school, grade 10 science. If you remember this, he was talking about how scientists are lazy, and that's why they just developed all these things so we can do things easier and have more free time.
Love it.
Where that video, I didn't close that loop, where that video went was that to be a full citizen or to be a great person of history, you have to have the ability to be lazy, to have downtime where you aren't constantly being productive, so you can focus on endeavors that are truly your gift, your benefit. Like, what's his name? The mushroom guy. He's a monomaniac that focuses entirely on mushrooms, and Paul Stamets, and he's pretty much driving the field forward single-handedly.
Right. And I guess in his early days of starting that, people may have called him lazy if he was slacking off at work because he was too busy obsessing over mushroom articles, or not wanting to work and taking a part-time position so that he can focus on his mushroom hobby. You can imagine that...
sounds familiar.
In America, where it's very individualistic, you would have people saying he's lazy. So the fundamental attribution error of bringing it down to personal characteristics, saying he's a bad person and then engaging in judgment because of that. And that's kind of why that question came about, was when it comes down to blaming everything on everyone's personal characteristics, are we blaming the victim when it comes to poverty in America?
Yes, I think a lot of the time America suffers from a chronic case of, well, that's where I was going to go with that, meritocracy.
Yes. Both
Both meritocracy and laissez-faire capitalism. Both are terrible because they end up where we currently are. Like, why I wanted to talk about internalized capitalism, we'll get to it, but is like this whole podcast, like this is me kind of trying to both help the discourse in whatever small way I can, or we can, and also monetizing one of my hobbies, which is just looking up and researching stuff and discussing interesting ideas. So like even that is, I guess I'm trying to fight against that laziness that would be leveled against us. But for Stamets, for instance, for the mushroom guy, he would be labeled lazy until it started making money. When people saw that it was making money, then suddenly he's a genius.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of frustrating part of all this.
Exactly. And so the initial judgments until it makes money, and money being the only metric for success. And we tend to judge people who are not making money, people who are living in poverty in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. There's quite a bit of poverty. The
wealthiest country in all of history and in the world for sure. And yet they can't afford to have like basic social supports that would allow people to take more risks entrepreneurially, for instance, that would help the economy. Yeah. It's a whole thing, man.
Yeah. And so not looking at situational factors of how that person got there and why the system's failing them.
Pull them up by their bootstraps, which is ironic because it was literally an impossible task and still remains to be one.
Yeah.
But before we move on, I didn't fully mention the meritocracy thing. There's been a couple books I've read about this where they seem to be turning their back on that concept as generally a bad idea, because the whole Meritocracy Trap is one of the book's names. I don't remember. One of them was good and one of them was really, really dry. I don't talk about it often because I don't have a solution or a fully formed take on it, but its argument is basically that meritocracy actually screws the lower half and really screws the upper 10% as well. Because while we look at these rich and glamorous people, they typically have to constantly be training and don't have downtime and constantly have to up their game or else they'll be judged by other people. And that judgment is, fear of failure is a huge thing for a lot of people. But I got in this debate kind of in line with that too, about how fame is abuse in a way, because the more famous you are, the less you can actually do, and the more you just get random hate from people unsolicitedly, spontaneously all the time. So it's this whole intermingling cycle. And I don't know if this is clear at all.
Yeah, meritocracy is the idea, if you're not familiar, it's the idea that you get what you deserve based on your efforts and how good you are at something,
right,
which encourages people to just, like you said in the Japanese example, spend all their time trying to get good, and then it puts everyone in a rat race. And so the top 10% spends their whole life working.
Well, yeah. Like if we look at even the most rich people, like many of them are not just having leisurely 10-hour work weeks. They're having like 60, 80-hour work weeks. And I'm not saying to pity them either, but I think we can agree that the system isn't great for us to think that only the best will survive, this kind of a social Darwinist approach to things.
Yes.
But I think we're kind of getting into the weeds a bit.
Well, it still relates to the idea of blaming the victim of this type of a system, that if somebody chooses to opt out of playing that game, that they are inherently lazy and bad.
Right.
This brings me back to one of our discussions earlier about losers. Remember the loser discussion?
Of course. Because I'm the one that edits these things, and we just released it not too long ago.
If you're interested, what episode is it in?
That's episode 3. Yeah. I think it's where we first get our stride. It's one of our most listened to episodes. So.
The growth mindset, one of my favorite episodes. We talk about the concept of losers, and this relates to this because we blame people, and that's an inherent thing we might level at someone. But even to zoom in closer, the lawn feces example.
Yeah.
I do want to call that back.
Sure.
Are we engaging in fundamental attribution error? If somebody strolls into your lawn, takes a dump on it, and walks away, and then we say, that person's a loser, as you said back then.
No, I don't think I labeled him a loser. I don't think it was quite so cut and dry that way.
No,
I think
it wasn't.
What happened was I said that sometimes there are losers. I was trying to think of the prototypical loser. And that one I think was a bad example because we addressed that the more compassionate, just shit on somebody's lawn is pretty out of character a lot of the time. And if it isn't, then yeah, I guess you are an asshole probably, or seriously mentally unwell again, which is probably the more likely thing. But that's the issue. I think a lot of time.
Situational factor.
Well, yeah, but I think a lot of the time, mentally unwell, that can be situational, but can also be an internal stable trait if it's genetic. Yeah. But also, thing is, mental health problems often present as being an asshole, as often as being abrasive. And that's the difficult thing.
You're meaning like personality disorders specifically?
No, I'm not. I'm saying depressed people can also, one of the manifestations of depression can be being irritable and being easily triggered by whatever and having a negative lashing out reaction. Yeah. So a lot of the time, many forms of addiction, or not addiction, mental health, including addiction, can manifest as being just an intolerable person. And if we look at personality in particular, that's even trickier because where does the person end and the mental health problem begin? They're both part of the system, and maybe it's situational. It was triggered by a sudden stress event, but it could still become a chronic thing within them. Either way, that's why I think that while I do agree that we should probably look at the context, we should also, I think your response from that one that I took away from it, that I've still been thinking about, was the more compassionate approach because, again, it's all kind of coming together with things I've been thinking about lately, that it's not their fault. They can't control it. They couldn't do any different. And if we were them, we would be doing the same. Yeah. So I think it all kind of ties together that we should try to aim for compassion regardless. Yeah. Which can be easier said than done.
Yeah. In the case of addiction, there's a long history to this too. Maybe we can talk about the war on drugs in the future, but to moralize addiction has been a huge problem, and to
for sure
incarcerate people with addictions and to call them bad people. There's a long history of that happening. So that's kind of
Chasing the Scream.
Yeah.
That's a book, just because people don't know about that. It's a book that talks about addiction and how basically the American system dealing with people to do with drugs and addiction is essentially creating as many. It's like if you wanted to make a system to make as many addicts as possible, that would be a great way to do it, the American system.
Yeah. There was a quote that I was thinking of before. I have it on my Instagram, and it's by...
What is your Instagram, by the way? We don't plug anything ever. We really should probably do it more.
We really should. Steve.rose.phd.
Okay, it's easy enough. With a S-T-E-V-E.
Yeah,
I don't know why I need to clarify that.
.rose.phd. And if you wanted to check it out, you can go add me on there. But there's a recent quote picture that I recently put out, and it's by Viktor Frankl.
Good old Viktor
Frankl. He says, "No person should judge unless they ask themselves in absolute honesty whether in a similar situation they might not have done the same."
This is a recurring pearl of wisdom from a bunch of different traditions. Like
the Christian tradition too.
A Christian, yeah, like he who cast the first stone should be one without fault or whatever it is. Or the sliver in somebody else's eye when you have a log in your own, something to that effect.
Yeah, judge lest ye be judged type of thing.
Right. Many instances of that. Being reiterated.
The psychological concept of fundamental attribution error has this broader wisdom tradition backing it, and you can really see the connection there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the delosers exist. We determined that someone who's presenting with that kind of or psychosis wouldn't be applicable to label them in such a way, having a more compassionate response. I know in that episode, you came up with an example of someone who just complains and doesn't change anything. That was kind of where you landed on using...
Somebody that has the ability to change, but then chooses not to. I've listened to a recent Sam Harris podcast on free will. I've listened to it twice now. That and the book Self-Compassion, really good book that you apparently mentioned to everybody, but you just did it in passing to me once.
Yeah.
That one is also very good, but they both kind of coincide on the same sort of thing that we're basically just consciousness piloting a meat robot that has a bunch of calibrations, and we're placed in a specific context in time, and we're just kind of reacting to that. There is some control, but the metaphor I used for this when I was thinking about it, I sent to you, was we didn't choose this ship and we can't control the winds or the currents, but we can do what we can to captain the ship to try to help people on the way. If we find drowning people, we can hoist them up and help them into the boat. But however good the boat is, or however good the winds or favorable the winds or currents are, we don't have any real say over. So I think given that, we can't blame somebody for not helping if they're unable to steer the boat in a way that would be conducive for helping.
Yeah, and this whole discussion gets into the question of free will very much.
Which clearly I don't really think is a thing. I even wrote an argument paper against it on one of my websites.
So if we don't have free will, then can anyone really be a lazy loser? These types of labels that we would level at someone.
Yes, because it's just the same as any other attribute. You look at the average and then you see where they land on that spectrum. If they're at the 99th percentile, you could say they're comparatively lazy.
So quantitative. You would just come up with a metric and then see where they land. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's psychology, right? You have to, because people, the freaking annoying part about talking to people who have never studied it is they say that you're generalizing too much. It's well, we're talking about a general population. What do you expect me to do? Speaking specifics on individuals? What? Yeah. That's not how this works.
Yeah.
So this is how we approach these things. However, even without free will, that doesn't really matter because we're still responding to the environment. And judgments like that, they still matter because even if we are just responding to the context, having a social context still affects how we act. So whether we choose to respond to the social context or not, again, that's still kind of built into the wiring. That still would shape some people to be more or less likely to do something.
Yeah. And it's correctly identifying when it's a situational factor and when it's an intrinsic factor.
But I'm arguing that it's always situational because we never choose the situation of our bodies. We never choose the situation of a lot of things. We can try to influence them to some degree. I can choose to notice my mood and reframe it as, oh, it's been a bad day so far, but it will pick up, and trying to go forward in that way. Even that, I would have had to have come across the idea and have the ability to notice that thought and to label it as something that needs to be fixed.
Yeah.
And all these things are situations that we don't choose. That's kind of what I'm saying. But I guess I'm getting maybe a little bit lost in the philosophy that I was saying I was worried about before the podcast, where maybe a lot of the time when it comes to addressing these things, the reason that it matters for survival, a lot of the time going back to that, is that we need to be able to predict whether somebody else is going to be erratic or consistently violent or in some way not helpful or damaging to us, and acting accordingly. And I think when it comes to strangers, we're just less liable to give them the benefit of the doubt in this way.
Yeah. And it goes kind of back to our first little quibble about do causes affect how we should respond? And I say not necessarily. I think...
Wait, can you clarify that question?
Whether the person was rushing to the hospital and cut you off, or they were just being selfish, it doesn't necessarily matter. You should still be careful around them either way.
Yeah.
Why it does matter, in my argument, is that it changes your level of anger and therefore your actions. Even though you should be cautious, it's hard to do so when you're now angry and wanting retaliation.
Yeah.
So the ethics of it and the psychology of it are a little bit separate.
I guess going again back to this, I'm ringing that bell again. They're not choosing, even the person, like let's suppose a person like gleefully cut you off. They're like, hey, watch this. I'm gonna screw this guy. I'm not gonna like really put his life in danger. I'm gonna freak him out. And they're laughing about it in their car. Even if that's the case, that person did not choose to be such a psychopath, right? That is just foisted upon them.
You just took it there. Wow.
Yeah, that's where I was going with that whole, like, we don't choose any of these calibrations. They're just, whether I am very sensitive to risk or not, I don't choose that. And the way I kind of see personality these days, at least, human behavior in general, is that we're just a bunch of different kind of thermostatic metrics. So like how much we need for something to be annoying, how much time or threshold before we get hungry, or whatever these kind of thresholds are met in different contexts, they'll be triggered in that way. Like that's kind of how I view our behavior, or any animal's behavior, really.
Super deterministic.
I am a determinist. Yeah. Because like it's the only thing that makes sense. Of course, things in the past affect things now, and we can't break out of that.
Well, effect is different than determine.
You could say that if I throw a ball at your head and it hits you in the coconut, then that is determined that I threw the ball and it hit you in the head. My influence on the situation determined that you would get hit in the head, and assuming that my aim is great and you aren't paying attention.
Now the question would be, does it then determine my response as well?
Yes.
Or could I choose to respond differently by reframing it as, oh, he's just going through stuff right now?
No. That's misunderstanding, because your ability to rephrase it is part of you being able to, that's just part of your calibration, right?
I know you would argue that, yes, I did choose to reframe it, but I was destined and determined based on my makeup.
Not destined.
I was determined to reframe it based on my history and makeup.
Yeah, it's a distinction between fatalism and determinism. Fatalism means that something that happens was always meant to happen. Yeah. Not the case. Determinism is that based on who you are, your history, the state of the universe, you would do this and you can't do any other.
Yes. It's almost like the algorithm predicted that you respond this way.
Yeah. And to tie up this loose end that I can hear possibly some people having objections to, if you want to talk about, say, quantum physics and being unable to predict that, and they seem to be completely random, then our choices, as Harris points out, is either we are determined by things that have happened and we have a choice, but we can't choose otherwise. It's just we will react in that situation the best we can at that time, or it's all fundamentally random at a at a quantum level, and then nothing is predictable at all and everything is random. So either way, it doesn't seem to have space for free will. Either it's complete randomness or causes have effects. Sorry, effects have causes.
This is getting super abstract.
That's as far as I wanted to go for that. Yeah. That's the final point. Salvaging free will with randomness is not a good course of action.
Yeah. And the reason why we go so deep into free will, I guess, because you can't separate the discussion of free will from fundamental attribution error theoretically.
From attribution theory.
Attribution theory, yeah. But I guess in practice, we don't have to have a inner dilemma over free will every time someone cuts us off.
Right, yeah. You did ask me briefly earlier. I mean, like, this is always dangerous with me if I had any thoughts. Because I have two notes here that came to mind as I was just waking up today, knowing that we were going to talk about this. One is that when I've been in other contexts or with people that don't know me very well, I would catch myself thinking something along the lines of like, oh, they only know this version of me. They don't know the real me. They don't see who I really am. When I was in Australia, I was broke as hell and I was eating a lot of grilled cheese because cheese there is hella cheap, man. I was like a kilogram of cheese for $6 Australian, which is like $4 US, I think. Yeah, so I was eating grilled cheese because it's the cheapest thing I could buy, living like a backpacking kind of hobo. And that was the first time in my life that I actually did that. And I remember thinking this distinctly at that time quite a bit. But I started kind of following that down the rabbit hole, because it's like, okay, then who is the real me? Is there a real me? Is the me that you know, Steve? Do you know who the true me is? You know a context, a version of me, and you've seen me in various contexts. So I guess you have an idea. You have a better idea than most. But is that not still a version of me, still a true version of me, or is it not? Because I was in a different situation.
It's one of many versions. Do you have a specific question about this?
No, it was just a thought to do with that, because my takeaway was that is a version of me, and we are all pluralities. We're all a bunch of different. Yep. I would say states. I remember this other talk again on Sam Harris. I've been listening to his podcast lately. This guy talking about how we have different personalities built into us. Though I would change that. He was a psychedelics guy, and so he would see it as when taking the psychedelics, it kind of removes the barrier between you and everything else. For LSD, I think specifically, and they see themselves as part of the universe, and then they kind of zoom back in as they come down, and they say, oh, I guess I was the universe. I am still the universe, but I guess I'm this pocket of the universe that is like this middle-aged accountant guy who likes Star Wars. Like that's who this guy is. It just kind of coming down. And his perspective was that we all have different personalities. To me, it's just we all have different states of existing and how we respond to things. There's a book called Changing Traits, I think it was called, because it made a distinction for meditation. If you meditate now, if you are a novice, then you can probably change your state, which is temporary. But they were arguing that over time you can change a trait. So it's an enduring thing that you can do, that over time you'll subtly shift the direction of the ship, if going by that metaphor that I mentioned.
Yeah. Changing your states often enough changes your trait, which is a kind of a brain pathway.
Right. You're digging a trough toward where you want to go. And every time you traverse it once, you go down that path once, it makes it slightly deeper. Yeah. So the more you do it, the more your brain's going to be primed to do it. One other thing, the last thing I want to say about the contextual self was that somebody pointed out that we have different personalities in different languages. So who I am in Chinese is vastly different than who I am in English, because my Chinese is so simple. I can have basic conversations. I will still have a similar philosophical underpinning, but I won't have these discussions, obviously, because I can't. So instead, who they see is like, that's a weird warped version of me, frankly. It's a much shallower version, I think, in some ways.
A very simple version of you.
Yeah. And then I started thinking about that with a lot of my other friends, because a lot of them, English is their second language. Yeah. There's this quote from Modern Family, Sofia Vergara. She says, "Don't you know how funny I am in Spanish? Like, I have these jokes and I have to translate them to English, and it just, this frustration." Yeah. That was it. That's all my extra thoughts.
That's really actually perfectly related to the last thing I wanted to bring up, which is related to fundamental attribution error. It's actually called ultimate attribution error. Huh. The ultimate attribution error.
It's the best one, the top one, the one you want to achieve.
Yeah. Actually, it's the worst one. It leads to genocide.
Whoa. This sounds like we're moving to essentialism, reducing groups down to an essential trait.
Yes. So it's the same psychological process, but on the group level.
Right.
It's a tendency to judge your in-group favorably. And if they do something bad, it's because of situational factors, and to judge out-groups as inherently bad because of something inherent about that.
Corruption, corrupt character.
The corrupt character of that group.
This one was called ultimate attribution error?
Ultimate attribution error.
Okay, because I'm not familiar with this one. Yeah, that makes sense. It's like taking in-group, out-group dynamics to an extreme. Yeah.
So this has huge consequential effects, and you can look at U.S. politics and how this is played out, particularly with the immigration. Before COVID, everyone was talking about immigration. It was all...
Same with Europe, too.
Yeah, immigration, the Brexit, this was like the top news story every day. The migration from Mexico and all of that, and how are they going to stop it?
But that's just generally a conservative playbook to get people scared and having like a unified enemy to push more restrictive authoritarian measures. That's not going to stop. Even now, there are people talking about that. Like China, for instance, kept saying that it was foreign causes, foreign people did this whenever there was an outbreak. Yeah. But the thing is, they weren't allowing foreigners even back into the country. They were mainly allowing Chinese nationals to return, and with them came the virus. And so they just point out, like, foreigners, like, it's just we're othering groups massively just for political gain, it seems. Anyway, we should talk about takeaways because we're reaching our limit for our normal time frame.
So what are your big takeaways here?
I think my big takeaways are that we can always see that everything is kind of contextual, and even like the things that we do that are great to the things that we do that are shameful, well, we should always aim to be better. We should be compassionate, I guess, is the number one thing for ourselves and for others, and be more understanding of the context that they're likely going through. Because if we were in their context, we would be doing the exact same thing if we were them in their context, that is. And that's regardless of whether we think they did it on purpose, which frankly, they probably didn't. They might at worst have been careless. We can still choose to control our response to these things, because it's only going to hurt us if we end up flying off the handle.
You took the words right out of my mouth. This is exactly the way I was going to conclude. And once again...
Well, Steve, then you're really good at these closings, because
once again,
I took the words from your mouth.
Swooping. Yeah, I guess I'm the great one now.
I'm giving it to you. It's not, I'm psychically reading your mind from Toronto.
Yes. So this was my closing, narrated by Phil. Took the words right out of my mouth.
Right.
Big takeaway is compassion.
Yes, compassion is a takeaway.
Compassion.
Before we cut off here, I do want to have a call to action, if you will. If you're listening to this on Spotify or Google Play, that sucks, because apparently you can't do any reviews on there. But if you like this, please share it to people. I'm priming you now. Please do it, because we are small and nobody's heard of this yet. And also, it helps us if you could put a review on some app. If it's not Spotify, not Google Play, you can put a review for us, because apparently that helps push us to other people who might enjoy this, might find it valuable. If you found it valuable, please consider doing so.
Yes, I agree. I completely agree.
Also, we never really say it. I am Phil. He is Steve. You can find more of him at steverosephd.com. You can find more of me at hittingeject.com or makeaskillcheck.com. These are the ones I'm currently managing. That's it for housekeeping. So thanks for tuning in, and we hope to speak to you again next time.
Take care. I think it was very good.
Sounds good to you at all times, because you just love the sound of my voice and all my thoughts.
All right. That's...